All right, we are live and we are discussing capitalism versus the Vatican. Let me go ahead and go live on Instagram here as well. Capitalism versus the Vatican is our subject. I could have put it as the Vatican versus capitalism because it's really kind of more of a if we were to talk about an attack one direction or the other, I think that would probably be the way, at least nowadays. But yeah, capitalism versus the Vatican. Let me just start from the beginning by giving all the disclaimers and making it very clear from the beginning that I am not here to bash on Catholics. That's not the point. I do not hate Catholic people. I'm going to try and, like, this whole presentation, I'm going to sit here and try to picture that I'm talking to one of my Catholic friends, because I have Catholic friends, I have Catholic family. I see we got some people joined already. Welcome, welcome. This is going to be live on YouTube, X, Instagram, and Facebook. And then I'm also going to post the audio on the podcast, so you can catch that on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. All right, got that out of the way. What we're going to talk today is private property. So really the foundation of the American system, the American economy, the American way of doing things, the capitalist system that we love, which, by the way, you cannot have a republic without capitalism. I do not believe that in this world you can have freedom without a free market capitalist system, just as your basic foundation. And so an attack on capitalism is in turn an attack on the American system. And so it's an important subject. Again, this is not to bash Catholic individuals. That will not be the point of this at all. We are talking about the Vatican. We are talking about the leadership. So unless you are like bishop level or cardinal, unless I got the Pope on here listening, I'm not really here to attack you. And even them, hey, I have nothing personally against these people. I'm disagreeing with the ideas. Okay, so nobody come into the comments and get mad at me and say, oh, you hate Catholics or whatever, because that's not what I'm doing. I am studying this morning a very interesting book. This is called Ecclesiastical Megalomania. Get yourself a copy of this if you do not have one already. Try to find it. It's not easy to find. I would recommend probably looking up in places like, where you can find used books, because you're not going to find this book very easily for cheap. But if you find a used copy, it's a fantastic reference. What this book is, and you can't read the subtitle there, but by the way, in the comments, if there's any issues with the audio, let me know and I'll make adjustments. The subtitle, this is Ecclesiastical Megalomania. It's a tongue twister. Ecclesiastical Megalomania. Ecclesiastical meaning related to the church. Megalomania, have you ever heard of a megalomaniac? Somebody who thinks that they are the grandest, the best, right? That's a megalomaniac. So we're talking about a church that thinks it is the best. And okay, all right, we'll leave that alone for now. And then the subtitle here is The Economic and Political Thought of the Roman Catholic Church. So again, we're talking about the thought leaders, not the people, not the average Catholic person. I'm not here to bash Catholics. We're talking about what the structure, what the Vatican and the thought leaders and the leadership over time, what they believe should be the ideal form of government and economy. Now, if you have any questions about this, all you have to do is look at history. We have at our disposal over 1,000 years of history that tells us what the world looks like when the Catholic Church gets its way, when it has ultimate power over a region, over countries, right? And that was the Middle Ages. If you don't know history on this, I mean, you should be mad at your public school teachers. But the Middle Ages, the Catholic Church ruled for 1,200 years, you know, large portions, if not all of Europe for a part of that time. And so if you want to know what it looks like when the principles of the Vatican are played out and they get to say, hey, this is how we think a country should run, how an economy should run, that's all you have to do. You could just look at the feudal Middle Ages. The system was called feudalism. And if you like feudalism, then you'd be happy with the principles of the Catholic Church. I personally do not like feudalism. I remember learning about it in school, and it was not a good thing. Today, there's a lot of apologists who try to make it out like, well, it wasn't all that bad. And you see people trying to, no. Feudalism, they give you a basic kind of overview of what it is. And what I'm going to do today is just to give you an idea. I'm going to quote Catholic leadership. Again, not the average run-of-the-mill Catholic. I was raised Catholic, by the way. I was raised, because I'm Mexican, at least part, and I was raised in California. And if you're raised as a California Mexican, Catholicism is just like in the water, right? It's like, it's the default position. It is what it is. When Christmas and Easter, we went to, in Salinas, that's where I'm from, Salinas, California, very Mexican community, Chicano community. We went to the local Sacred Heart Catholic Church. I still remember Sacred Heart. It's in Old Town Salinas. And that's where we went for Christmas and Easter. We didn't go every Sunday. We weren't that kind of Catholic. We were like, show up on Christmas morning and Easter, and that was about it. But that's kind of probably the majority of Catholics, right? It's a cultural thing. But I was raised Catholic. I have plenty of family that are Catholic. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to quote for you the leadership of the organization, what they say, and we're talking the highest authorities, the papal encyclicals. If you don't know what a papal encyclical is, I'm going to quote them today. And a papal encyclical is it's a letter. It's the equivalent in the Catholic Church of, because they do believe that they are the continuation of the apostolic church. So their leadership is like the new apostles, and the apostles wrote the New Testament. And what would happen if apostles existed today? They would probably write other letters. And so the Pope writes encyclicals, which are a letter from the Pope, an official letter, which I don't think Catholics would put on the same level as, a letter from Paul to the Romans, for example, the book of Romans or something like that in the Bible. But it's pretty important. It's pretty important to Catholics, papal encyclicals. So I'm going to quote those. I'm going to quote the highest sources, and I'm going to show you over hundreds of years what the Catholic Church has said. This is what we think government should look like and the economy should look like. And you will see that it is diametrically opposed to the American system. Again, you can think that's a good thing. You can think that's a bad thing. That's we have freedom of beliefs and conscience in this country, thankfully, in America. But it wasn't like that in the Middle Ages when the Vatican ruled over Europe. But that's what it's like in America today. You can believe that. You can like that if you want. I personally like the American system. I like freedom. I like freedom of speech. I like freedom of conscience. I like freedom of religion. I like freedom of the press, for example. I like our American freedoms. I don't think the papal feudalism that happened during the Middle Ages was a good thing. I think it was very bad. Call me crazy. When there was serfs and peasants and so forth, I thought that was a very bad system. So what was feudalism? The feudal system in the Middle Ages was a hierarchical social and political structure in Europe, roughly from the 9th to the 15th century. So we're talking a long time, hundreds and hundreds of years. Kings granted large estates to nobles or lords in exchange for loyalty, military service, and governance. Lords, in turn, provided land to vassals, knights, and lesser nobles for similar obligations. At the bottom were the peasants and the serfs who worked the land. You hear a lot of people nowadays talk about how you will own nothing and you will be happy. It was not all that different from that. with some caveats. At the bottom were the peasants, who worked the land, owning labor and a portion of their produce to lords, and protection and the right to farm. So basically, it was a system where you, as a serf, the average person, a serf, a peasant, you worked the land and you gave a chunk of it to your lords who protected you, the knights and so forth, and they were your bosses. And there was no room to move up in the social ladder. You could not be a clever peasant and just rise to the top. I mean, there was no freedom. There was no freedom of, speech and thought and liberty and all this kind of stuff. It was a rigidly controlled system. I mean, the American founding fathers would view this as hell on earth, right? It was the opposite. Daily work life for peasants. It was hand to mouth. You worked enough and you made it. And you grew enough to survive, and you had enough food to survive. And you give your excess to your lords, and your living conditions were not very good. Life expectancy 30, 40 years. I mean, part of that was the times, right? So I'm not going to knock too much on that, but the general idea of just being a peasant, a serf, where you are tied to the land, you must work the land, you must give a large portion of your labor to your lords above you. And that was the system that the Catholic Church set up for hundreds of years. Now, there is no denying the fact that they were in charge. You have to imagine what life was like back then. The Middle Ages was a system where the Pope had power over kings. And therefore, because it's a very simple logic here. If you have a country where one man's on top, you have a king and he controls the country. He's got his lords and so forth underneath him, but he controls them. They control the people. And so it's like, pyramid hierarchy type structure. It's a totalitarian system. And all you have to do to control a totalitarian system like that is control the man on top. Very simple. So the king, yes, the king of the various countries in Europe was in charge of their system. But the way that the vast majority of people back then viewed life was they viewed it as there are two powers. And the Catholic Church often said this. Their leadership would often say this. There are two powers in earth. There is the power of the state, which generally back then was pretty much always was a king, right? And then there was the power in the church, and the leader there would be the Pope and his cardinals and bishops and so forth, right? And they said, okay, these two are like the sun and the moon. There's two different powers. One is more powerful than the other, just as the sun is more powerful than the moon. And according to Catholic teaching, it is the Pope who is more powerful than the king. Why? Again, you have to understand the mindset and a little bit of Catholic theology here. According to the Catholic Church, and this is not really controversial, but according to the Catholic Church, if the Pope decides that a king is out of bounds in whatever way he wants to, he has ultimate authority here, he can excommunicate the king and cut him off from heaven. He can basically say, look, you obey me or you're going to hell. You're lost eternally. Not only that, not only are you screwed in the afterlife because you disobeyed the Pope, according to Catholic theology, but you also lose all your power on this earth as well, because now, and this happened. This isn't just theory. This happened in history. The Pope can say to his people, who are also all Catholic back in the Middle Ages, virtually everyone was Catholic, unless you were hiding in the mountains like a Waldensian. They did exist in Europe. There were people hiding from persecution in the mountains, in the rocks, and in the wilderness. But, the vast majority, 90-something% of people were Catholic. The Pope would tell his servants, his people, the vast majority of the population, That king that disobeyed me, he is no longer king. In my eyes, I say he's done. And so you don't have to obey him anymore. So it was a virtual death sentence for the king. That's the basics of the system. If you're a historian, you're a history buff, you're like, oh yeah, there's some nuance. Yeah, okay. But that's the basics. Okay. So the Catholic Church was in power for hundreds of years and got to set up a system the way they wanted it to be. And what was the system? Feudalism, with serfs and peasants on the bottom. Do you like that kind of system? Politically, economically, do you want a system like that? I think it's a bad idea to have all the property, all the means of productions owned in the hands of, the great lords, the landowner, lords, knights, and then the people above them and so forth. And the peasants just work the land, and they have to give a large portion of their work, their labor, to their lords. And that was all you had. That was your life as a peasant. I think it's a horrible system. I think the capitalist system that we've created in America is diametrically opposed to that and far superior. And by the way, biblical. I don't think the feudal system was biblical. Okay, so we've laid the groundwork and we talked about the history, and this should kind of be common sense if you know history. You maybe have not put two and two together like this before, but all you have to do, if you say, look, what is Catholic teaching when it comes to how an economy should run, how a country should run politically? All you have to do is look at, well, what did it look like when they were in power in the Middle Ages? That's what it looked like. It was feudalism. And I'm going to head off a possible disagreement with me, because I know that some Catholics will argue. And again, if you're just joining, I am not here to bash Catholic individuals. We can disagree, and I'm just discussing history, and I'm going to give quotes, and so this is just facts. We can disagree without any hate. I don't hate anybody here, and I'm talking about the leadership. I'll say that. I've already said it multiple times. I'm talking about the Vatican, the popes, the cardinals, bishops, not the average Catholic. All right. But I know that some people will argue that, okay, yeah, that's what the church believes, but it's a church. I've heard this kind of argument before. This is one of the things that was argued by, say, for example, Matt Walsh, when the new pope was first put into office, elected pope, whatever you call it. And it came out some of the views of that pope, and you could see his views on like immigration and his opposition to Donald Trump, and his disdain for President Trump. And so, some Catholic conservative leaders like Matt Walsh, which I agree with Matt Walsh on like 90% of the time. I like his takes most of the time. So it's not an attack on Matt, but I disagree with him on religion, and he is a prominent Catholic conservative. So guys like Matt Walsh, and who's the other one at the Daily Wire? I always forget his name because I don't pay attention to him. Not Ben. Ben's obviously not Catholic. If you know, say it in the comments if you know the other guy I'm talking about. Anyway, Michael Knowles, that's it. They were defending the idea or the views of the Pope, and they're basically trying to make it seem like these are just private views of a religious leader. Doesn't really matter. It does matter. It matters in the Catholic system more than it matters in any other religious system. And the reason why is because the Catholic system views the church as having a right, a divine right to rule over the government. And they have exercised that right over hundreds of years. For example, during the Middle Ages, they did that. They view that that's their goal in the future, to have control again over the government and to make laws reflect Catholic thinking. So the views of the Pope on what a government should look like, what the economy should look like, are important because they think that those views should become law all over the world, not just in the Vatican, all over the world. That is Catholic theology. If you want to debate that with me, feel free in the comments to debate the idea that the Vatican views itself as having the right to rule over the world and over secular governments, because there is hundreds of years of documents where they have said that very clearly, and recently. I mean, every single pope has said that. Every single pope in modern times, at least. So I know some people will argue, who cares? It's just what the church, views, and they're, it's a church, whatever. They have strategies. The Catholic Church has strategies for how to take over a republic. So in this book, which I've shown you multiple times, I haven't quoted it yet. I'm going to try not to quote large sections, because that makes for not as interesting, content when I'm just reading to you. But I'm going to quote some select sections. But there is a section here. I mean, there's a whole chapter on private property. It's very interesting stuff. Universal destination of goods. That's another way of saying welfare state, or, the redistribution of wealth. Taking from one group, having the government redistribute it among other groups. Tons of quotes on that. That is essential Catholic theology teaching. You can be a conservative Catholic and disagree with that, but you are opposed, by having that position, you are opposed to the position of the leadership of your church. You can do it, but your church leadership, including the Pope, disagrees with you. And I'm not talking just, the liberal popes like Francis. No. Every pope, John Paul II, every modern pope for hundreds of years have said this. Hundreds of years, repeatedly. There's a section on feudalism. There's a whole section on liberation theology, if you heard of that. And you say, there's certain groups and certain pose. Okay, yeah, but in practice, what did they do? Liberation theology happened. The redistributive state. And then there's a whole section on the political part, just having all the power, basically preferring kings and things like that, as opposed to what we have in America. Then there's a strategy on, or a section, chapter 18 is called Strategy for Subverting a Republic. That's in 183. I'm gonna look here. The idea is to have Catholic thought leaders go into power in non-Catholic countries and direct the laws. That's the idea. Let me see if I can find the quote for you. So Catholic leaders like that, and I'll just explain while I'm looking, have done things like support. This has happened in America, for example. The New Deal legislation. The New Deal legislation, if you are a conservative, which I imagine most of the people who are listening to me are conservatives, or you're a liberal troll and you want to, you just kind of want to poke and watch, that's fine. Welcome, trolls. I'm a conservative. Hey, whatever. You can believe whatever you want. But most would say that the New Deal and FDR were not good things that happened to America. It was the start of a very bad decline. But that's, it's not the view of the Church of Rome. And their leadership was behind a lot of these things. I'm having a hard time finding this quote. I'll come back to it. Wait, did we find it? All right, I'll come back to it. We'll look at some other quotes now. I think I've given a sufficient introduction. All right. So the universal destination of goods. Before I quote this, I want to set the stage. To understand what we're talking about here, we want to understand the capitalist system, free market system. The basics of it is private property. You own your property. What does that mean? What does it mean that you own your own stuff, your own car? Well, you can buy it. You have the title that says it's yours. Somebody tries to steal it, you can go to the courts and say, hey, this person's stealing my property. That's my stuff. They're trying to take it. They try to steal my car, whatever. Okay, you have the title. You paid for it. Your labor paid for it, or whatever. Your family gave it to you. Doesn't matter. It's yours. Private property. This is the basis of the American system of freedom. You cannot have a republic. You cannot have freedom without private property, because if the state owns everything, if they own all of the power to, factories to make food, and they own all the cars, and they own all the buses and the transportation systems, and they own everything, then you are at their mercy, because they can just cut you off and say no more food for you, right? That's the idea. You cannot have freedom without private property. And private property is something that comes from God. It is a divine right. There's a lot of leftists who talk about rights. You have a right to this, that, and the other. You have a right to everything under the sun, according to leftism. That's not the biblical view. The biblical view, you do not have a right to your fellow humans' property, right? And to their labor. No. But in the Bible, you do have a right to property. That's one of the few things that, there's not a, list of 50 rights that you have that the state should guarantee. You have the right to education, right to this, right to that, right to welfare, right to blah, blah, blah. No. But in the Bible, you have a right to property. How do we know that? It's in the Ten Commandments. It's in the Ten Commandments, chiseled in stone, written in stone, rather, by the finger of God and spoken from his own mouth from Mount Sinai. Thou shalt not steal. Well, you can't steal if everything is owned commonly, right? So you see how communism is an attack on God, right? Communism is an attack on God. It directly contradicts the Ten Commandments. So I do not believe you can be a consistent Christian and be a communist. It's not possible. You have to reject communism if you're a Christian. It's right at the basics, right? God gives, you have property. In Israel, when they set up ancient Israel, each man was given a portion of land. Was divided up. God didn't set up a system where it was like, okay, well, let's have all the land owned communally, and then we'll have some really special people who are smarter than the rest of you, and they will divide up the food. And so, no, that's not how God set up the system. He said, okay, every family will divide up the land among the tribes, and then among the tribes, we'll divide it among the families, and you had your individual property. That's the Bible system, right? And you did not have to give a bunch of your money and a bunch of your produce to some lords and nobles who ruled over you like in feudalism. No, it's not the Bible system. We took that idea in America, and that's the basis of capitalism. You can't have businesses and all this stuff without private property. Now, what if I was to say, let's separate private property, the ownership of your land or your car or your house, whatever it is, let's separate that from the right to actually use it. Then we start getting very tricky here. What do I mean by this? What if the government has the power to say, yeah, you own that land? So now we're shifting away from the biblical view. Now we're talking about like the perversions in modern political view, what man has done to private property. So a government comes in and says, yeah, you own your car or whatever, but I'm going to tell you how you can use it. You can only use it, at this time, and you can only drive this far, and you can, only do this, that, and the other. By the way, you have to pay all this, these things in order to use it. There's all these rules, and I tell you exactly how you can use your car and the very few ways you can use it and ways you can't. Do you really own it if you have no freedom on how you use it? No. And that was the brilliance, devious brilliance. Let me be very clear, because it was a bad thing. But that was the devilish cleverness of fascism. Fascism was a very bad thing. And what the fascists figured out, because the fascists were all leftists. If you've been lied to by our public schools, you need to go read Dinesh D'Souza's book, The Big Lie. And he documents very clearly how all the fascist leaders were all former communists, and they just created a new flavor of communism called socialism. And that's what fascism was. That's why the party, the political party in Germany, was called the National Socialists. They were socialists. They were leftists. They believed in a totalitarian society, which is the opposite of the right. The right believes in freedom, not totalitarian. Which, by the way, just kind of a side note, I've been listening to Rush Limbaugh lately, just his old stuff. And it's sad to me how we don't have thought leaders like Rush anymore, because we are just kind of drifting. The right, the conservative, whatever you want to call it, not necessarily loyal to the Republican Party, because the Republican Party is a joke. But I'm talking about conservatives and people generally on the right. We're just kind of drifting. We don't have a leader. And so I see things, you go on places like X, which I'm on, and I see the rise of this view on the right for totalitarian government, which I don't think this stuff would become as popular if Rush was still around. Our founding fathers would have men tarred and feathered for these ideas. The idea of, we need a king. And I see this stuff. Oh, Franco, the fascist dictator in Spain, he was a good guy. I see this kind of stuff on the right. Nonsense. Dictators are anti-American. And I can't for the life of me understand, to me, it's, it's the equivalent, and be a little crude here. It's the equivalent of a political cuck for a man to want another man to rule over them as a king. What kind of self-respecting man wants a all-powerful leader in charge of them? That's the kind of stuff that they want on the left. They've done studies that show that as men's testosterone goes down, they're more likely to be socialists, because they want a leader, protector, powerful in charge of them. And so it's embarrassing to me to see this kind of stuff starting to rise on the right. Of course, it's not the majority. Don't misunderstand me, but I see some. So, we need this dictatorship. Oh, yeah, I wish the founding fathers were alive today to mock you if you have that view, saying that we need a dictator. Should be ashamed of ourselves, the people who say this kind of stuff. Anyway, that was a tangent. I was listening to Rush lately just because I miss him, right? Where was I going with this? All right, so we're talking about private property, then we were talking about fascism. That's where I was going. Okay. And we're going to wrap this up pretty soon here. Fascism perverted private property by saying, okay, yes, you have the title to your property, but you don't get to say what you can do with it. You are not in control of what you can do with it. And so it separated ownership on paper from use and what you actually get to do with it. By doing that, it was very clever, because it still kind of looked like capitalism on the surface, but the government was in full control. So businesses under the fascist system were told, who they can hire, how many people to hire, what wages to pay, what they can produce, how much stuff they can produce, what prices they needed to charge, blah, 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 blah. It was completely owned and managed by all these little detailed regulations so that you really didn't own anything. Nowadays, we hear that a lot, right? You'll own nothing and you'll be happy. Well, the fascists figured out a way to make it so that you thought you still own something, but you really own nothing because the government controlled how you can use it. You see what I'm saying? You own it on paper, you have no control over it and what you actually can do with it. That was the fascist system. That is what the Vatican wants. Again, I'm not here to bash Catholic individuals. Don't misunderstand me. But the Vatican likes that system. And they say so very clearly. If you are familiar with the man Thomas Aquinas, he's one of the greatest thought leaders of the Catholic Church, and he's often quoted by popes. That's what he said. So here's a quote from Thomas. And tell me, if I did not tell you that this was the great Catholic thought leader, Thomas Aquinas, this could be Barack Obama. This could be a leader on the left, if you didn't know. Okay, listen to this. Listen to this. Here's a quote. It is lawful for a man to succor or help his own need by means of another man's property by taking it, either openly or secretly. Nor is this, properly speaking, theft and robbery. It is not theft, properly speaking, to take secretly to use another man's property in case of extreme need, because that which he takes for the support of his life becomes his own property by reason of that need. Did I read, was that Bernie Sanders? No, that was Thomas Aquinas. And then you see popes quote Thomas Aquinas and talk about how, this is this is how we should run society. Okay, so you have to be very careful, because there could be some Catholics who will come and they will quote to me, some of these writings where it's like, oh, well, they said, here's the Pope saying private property is good. Okay, yeah, but keep reading. And then he says the state gets to decide how you can actually use your property. And in cases of extreme need, you can just take somebody else's stuff. Here is Pope John Paul II. So again, don't think that this is just, it's Francis, it's the liberal popes. No. Pope John Paul II. But yeah, the guy who opposed communism in Russia and all that and its expansion. Yes. And here's the thing that a lot of people get tricked on. You have to realize the Catholic Church, the Vatican, I'm not talking about individuals. The Vatican opposed communism. Why? Because it was a godless state and they allowed no say for the church. That's why they opposed it. Not because they disagreed with the general idea of the state having power over how you can use your property, etc. So it was imagine a disagreement. Please don't be offended by this, because I'm just using this as a loose analogy. I'm not saying they're the same, but imagine a disagreement during the Democrat primaries, and you have a disagreement between Hillary and Bernie, and they're fighting each other bitterly. But at the end of the primary, they're on the same side. And when you look at their policies, they're not hugely different, right? That's the difference between socialism and communism. That's the difference between communism and the views of the papacy. It's not all that much different. It's just fighting over who's going to be in charge. A godless state, or does the church get to run everything? So here's a quote. This is John Paul II, 1990. He said, in the words of the Second Vatican Council, God destined the earth and all it contains for the use of every individual and all peoples. Okay, so he's quoting the Second Vatican Council. But here's what the Second Vatican Council says. Now, the Vatican II, the Second Vatican Council, if you don't know Catholic theology, was a massively important, like all the cardinals get together, all the bishops get together, the pope's there, and we decide, like, the direction of the church for the next 100 years or something. It's very important. So this is not a small thing. And the writings, the decisions that came out of that were approved by the leadership of the church. So here is what John Paul quoted in greater detail. God intends the earth and everything contained in it for the use of all human beings, blah, blah, blah. He quoted that. Then it says, quote, the right to having a share of earthly goods sufficient for oneself and one's family belongs to everyone. If one is in extreme necessity, he has the right. How do you define extreme necessity? We're not told. If one is in extreme necessity, he has the right to procure for himself what he needs out of the riches of others. I don't have a big screen TV. I am in extreme necessity for a big screen TV. Therefore, when this riot happens in Minnesota, I can take, and it is not even theft. That's this theology. Don't think you think I'm exaggerating. I'm not. He has the right to procure for himself what he needs out of the riches of others. And then it goes on and says, this sacred council urges all, both individuals and governments. This is not just theology. It's not just ideas. It's something that they want to happen in legislation. Feed the dying man of hunger, because if you have not fed him, you have killed him. If government doesn't provide for all your needs, they've killed people. And then there's this whole discussion of natural law versus positive law, and you know there's a lot of discussion. I won't get into all that details now because that's going to bore you. Okay, here's the new deal. I was looking for this before I found the quotes. So again, do not think that this is just ideas. This is something that they want put into law. In fact, the encyclical Rerum Novarum, so the encyclical, this is Pius the 11th quoting Rerum Novarum. I believe Rerum Novarum was a previous Leo, and that's who we got the current, not ours, because it's not mine, the current Pope got his name from, and, you know, because of his views on the welfare state. Okay, so blah, 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 blah. It prevailed upon the people to develop. Okay, so here's the idea. Okay, I'm going to read this. There's a little bit of tricky language. Follow with me because this is very important. This is Pope Pius XI. He says, in fact, the encyclical, so papal encyclical Rerum Novarum, that's Latin words, whatever, it doesn't matter, completely overthrew those tottering tenets of liberalism. Now you have to understand, by liberalism in 1931, when this is written, we're talking like classical liberalism, meaning the stuff the American founding fathers believed. So got rid of those, which long hampered effective interference by the government. So they want the government to interfere. It prevailed upon the peoples to develop their social policy more intensely on truer lines and encouraged, now here's the important part, the elite among Catholics to give such efficacious help and assistance to rulers of the state. So now we're talking the elite Catholic individuals trying to convince rulers of the state, okay, quote again, that in legislative assemblies, they were not infrequently the foremost advocates of new policy. So what he's saying is, because of Pope Leo's writings in Rerum Novarum, they went and they attacked classical liberalism. That means the liberty of the American founding fathers, not modern liberalism. And they went and they pushed their views in legislation and for new policies. So they use Catholic elites to get their laws passed in society. Here's another quote, and this is from Newsweek, Joe Klein, 1996. The religion of Roman Catholicism The most significant in American politics, the ultimate swing vote, Catholics were the heart of the New Deal coalition. They were the Daily Machine in Chicago, the Curly Machine in Boston, Tammany Hall in New York. You ever heard of Tammany Hall? Go look that up. Tammany. Go look up Tammany Hall. But then realize that corrupt system was, well, who was at the heart of it? Okay. So they were behind the New Deal. They were behind that kind of stuff. So this idea of, we're going to decide what the government is like in a country, we're going to make it happen. There's another quote on this. It basically says the same thing. Pius XI again saying that they pushed, and they even used the school system through social sciences to push their ideas and make their ideas so common that even people who weren't Catholic were starting to spout their ideas and make them happen in legislative assemblies and in courts of justice. That was a quote, that in part. That's page 48 from this book. I could go on. Let me just wrap this up with just a little bit on private property, since that's where we started. So let's make that where we end as well. Private property. What do the popes say about your use of private property? Okay, here we go. John Paul II. This is on the chapter, The Universal Destination of Goods. So there's a ton of quotes in here about the welfare state, redistributing. This is from John Paul II, 1987, his encyclical on social concern. Quote, "It is necessary to state once more the characteristic principle of Christian social doctrine." So how a society should run. "The goods of this world are originally meant for all, for everyone. The right of property is valid and necessary, but it does not nullify the value of this principle." So the principle that everyone gets a right and a share to everything. Private property, in fact, is under a social mortgage. So we have it, but it can be tossed, which means that it has an intrinsically social function based upon and justified precisely by the principle of the universal destination of goods. So the important part is the universal destination of goods, meaning things go to everyone. And if your private property gets in the way of that, well, we can steal your private property. All other rights whatsoever, including private property and free commerce, are to be subordinated to this principle. So again, it's this clever idea that yes, you have private property, but we get to take it. At the highest authority, the Second Vatican Council said that. Okay, let me wrap this up. Again, I am not attacking Catholic individuals. I think if you are a Catholic conservative, I find it fascinating. I think a lot of them don't know these quotes that I gave. And so I would be curious to see their position and responses. So feel free to respond to me in the comments. What's the name of the book? I got a question here. This is, if you came late, this is Ecclesiastical Megalomania, the economic and political thought of the Roman Catholic Church. Good luck finding it new. You could probably find it at used bookstores. I'm not here to attack Catholic individuals, as I've said multiple times. What I don't understand is how you can be a conservative who opposes things like the welfare state, Obama and the government taking property and redistributing it to different people and being for freedom of ownership and private property. But then at the same time, be Catholic because your church leadership disagrees with you. Now, I'm not saying these people aren't sincere. Good people, good patriotic American Catholic people. I think a lot of them don't know these things. They don't know these quotes. They've never seen these quotes, and they've never sat down and thought what it was like when the papacy ruled over governments in the Middle Ages, what it was like. And when you understand this stuff, when you read these quotes, you can start to understand why our founding fathers were so cautious of the influence of the Vatican on American life and politics and so forth. It's interesting to me. So again, to summarize, the Vatican, the leadership of the Catholic Church, opposes the very foundations of capitalism, which is a system of private property. And to oppose that is to oppose the foundations of a free republic. And they have, the leadership, again, have gone and put their views not only into theory, but into practice in government systems, and want those things to happen today, and are behind a lot of the push today in America that is bringing upon this, things like the New Deal and the leftist socialist type of policies. So yeah, I said enough. I don't want to go too far there. I don't want to offend people too much. I just think this is something we should be able to discuss without people getting mad. All I did today, I just gave quotes and I talked about history. And I don't think anybody who would be offended by what I said could really show me how anything I said is not historically accurate, or, really explain away the simple interpretations that I've given of these quotes. I think these quotes speak for themselves. They can be understood. And yeah, I'll let the reader decide. We can agree to disagree, right? Without hating each other. So I'm trying to view this whole discussion as if I was sitting down with one of my Catholic friends and having it, and not to bash, but just to have this discussion. Cause I think it's fascinating, hey, you have to realize that the Vatican is powerful. There's a reason why the Pope was allowed to come and give a speech to a joint session of Congress, like he's the president. Not everyone's allowed to do that. Right. So, okay. This is part of a larger series. I'm going to, on my YouTube, which please, if you're not subscribing, go ahead and go there and subscribe, like and share. This video will be posted there, is live as well. But I have a larger series called The New World Order and Bible Prophecy, where I go into these subjects, and I'm doing one on American liberties. I'm creating it right now. So I'm going to go through things like freedom of speech and freedom of religion, and we'll see that those are also opposed by the Vatican. So these basics of American liberty, which are incompatible with things like Sharia law. That's something we often think of, but often we don't think of things like, what is the Vatican view on these things? What was it like during the Middle Ages? Did you have freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of religion? Could you worship God any way you felt the Bible told you to? Well, ask the Waldensians how that turned out, right? So I'm doing this series on the New World Order, because I oppose totalitarianism and the New World Order and Bible prophecy, and I'm going to go into those things. Your YouTube's in my bio. If you just search my name, you'll find it. Should be in the links in my bio as well, I believe. But it should be, it's just by my name on YouTube. Anyway, the series there is in here. I'll give you the link in the chat, because I see somebody asking. The series there, I go into those, and I go into the If you look up my name, Joshua Fontania, on YouTube, you're either going to find me or you're going to find a Filipino basketball player. so I'm not the Filipino basketball player. Yeah, just look my name, Joshua Fontania. And let's see, I think I can give you the link from here just in the chat. How do I do that? Yeah, dropping in the chat here now on Instagram. Okay, that's to this live. So you'll find it from there, at Josh Fontania. At Josh Fontania on YouTube. And I go into, get rid of that. Post it. There we go. I go into freedom of speech, freedom of religion, all that stuff. But then this one, I wanted to go into private property. So that's what the point of this was. So check out that series, The New World Order and Bible Prophecy, on my YouTube. The audio of this will also be put on a podcast, on Apple Podcasts, Spotify. Follow there as well, please. And this was live on X, Instagram, and Facebook as well. Just search my name on any of those places and you'll find me. Thank you guys for paying attention. And I look forward to doing these more often. God bless. Thank you as well, brother.